Everyone thought my daughter-in-law adored me. That was the story she told so well that even I almost believed it for a while. In public, she'd squeeze my arm and call me Mom with that soft smile people trust instantly. Neighbors said I was lucky. Friends from church nodded like it was settled fact. What they didn't see was how quiet a house can get when respect is only performed, not lived. I am Margaret Collins. I am 68 years old, and until a few years ago, I believed that if you stayed gentle long enough, the world would eventually return the favor. I raised my son, Daniel, on that belief. I worked double shifts at the diner after his father passed, packed lunches with handwritten notes, paid bills late so he could have new sneakers. I thought love was endurance. It took me years to realize how much pain I was calling loyalty. Daniel married Melissa 5 years ago. She was polished, sharp in that clean suburban way, always perfectly put together. At the wedding, she hugged me tight and whispered, "I'll take care of you too." People cried when she said it. I smiled because that's what you do when everyone's watching. After they bought their house, Daniel insisted I move in. "It'll be easier, Mom," he said. "We'll look out for each other." He sounded relieved, like he was setting something down he'd been carrying quietly for years. I didn't want to be a burden, but I also didn't want to be alone. So I said yes. At first, everything looked fine. Melissa made a point of asking me what I liked, but only when someone else was around. In front of Daniel's friends, she'd say, "Margaret prefers almond milk," like she'd memorized me. Once the door closed, the fridge told a different story. My groceries slowly disappeared from the shelves. The almond milk became regular milk, then none at all. When I asked, she'd blink and say, "Oh, I thought you weren't drinking that anymore." Her tone was light, casual, like I was misremembering my own habits. I started buying my own food and setting it aside. By morning, it was already gone. She rearranged the house one weekend while Daniel was out of town. My armchair, the one I'd used for years to rest my knees and read in the evenings, was moved into the guest room. "We needed more space in the living room," she said, already scrolling on her phone. I sat on the edge of the couch and felt like a visitor in a place I helped pay for. No one argued. No one explained. The house simply adjusted around me. Daniel worked long hours. When I mentioned small things, he waved them off. "Melissa's just stressed," he said. "You know how she is. Don't take it personal." He said it kindly, which somehow made it worse. Sometimes I wondered if he noticed how quiet I'd become. If the silence felt normal to him, or if he just trusted it because it made life easier. Silence became my contribution to the household. The disrespect wasn't loud. It was efficient. Sometimes refills ran late. It was always explained. It was never corrected. Dinner was served earlier and earlier, always before I came down the stairs. If I missed it, there were leftovers I could heat myself. "You're independent," Melissa would say with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. When Daniel praised her for managing everything so well, she laughed and said, "I try." Mistreatment usually looks like efficiency, especially when it's wrapped in good manners. The grandchildren picked up on it faster than anyone. Little comments slipped out. "Mom says you forget stuff. Mom says you're too slow." They didn't invent that tone. They borrowed it. I watched myself shrink in their eyes, not because I was weak, but because someone louder was deciding who I was. I didn't correct them. I told myself they were kids. I told myself love meant letting things slide. In public, Melissa was flawless. At block parties, she'd refill my drink before I asked, straighten my cardigan, tell people how lucky she was to have me. "She's basically my second mom," she'd say. People ate it up. Daniel beamed. I stood there, nodding, feeling like an extra in a play where my role had already been decided. Behind closed doors, she stopped knocking before entering my room. She sighed when I asked questions, like my curiosity was an inconvenience. The house felt smaller every day, and somehow I was the thing taking up too much space. I didn't confront her. Not because I was afraid, but because I was watching. I noticed patterns. Bills that came late. Mail that disappeared, then reappeared already opened. Comments that sounded caring but landed like correction. I told myself I was imagining things. For a moment, I even wondered if this was just age talking. Then I started writing things down, not to accuse, just to remember. Dates. Times. Small shifts that didn't feel accidental anymore. One morning, Melissa hosted a brunch for her friends. I helped set the table. She thanked me loudly, kissed my cheek, handed me a plate. After everyone sat, she said, "Mom, you don't have to hover. Go rest." The room laughed softly. I felt my face warm, not from embarrassment, but from clarity. I wasn't being helped. I was being managed. That afternoon, as I sat alone in my room listening to laughter drift down the hall, something settled inside me. Silence had been protecting them, not me. I didn't change overnight. I didn't announce anything. I simply stopped cushioning the house from the consequences of its own decisions. I stopped reminding, stopped compensating, stopped smoothing over moments that should have been questioned. I stayed calm. I stayed observant. I waited. Not because I was weak, but because timing matters. The performance was still perfect. The cracks were just beginning. Inside the house, the rhythm had shifted in a way I couldn't explain to anyone without sounding ungrateful. Nothing loud happened. No arguments, no slammed doors, no raised voices that neighbors could hear. It was quieter than that, and quiet changes are the hardest to point at. Melissa had become very good at quiet control. She didn't insult me. She didn't criticize me openly. She simply moved me out of the center of things and acted as if that was always the plan. Conversations adjusted around her comfort, not mine. Decisions were made before I knew they existed. My name was still spoken kindly, but my presence no longer seemed necessary. I was there the way furniture is there, noticed when it's in the way, ignored when it's useful. People stepped around me without thinking, like I had always been an obstacle instead of a person. I started hearing one word more than any other. Easy. It's easier if Mom eats earlier. It's easier if we don't involve her. It's easier if she doesn't worry about the bills. Easy is a dangerous word. It sounds considerate, but it usually means someone else is absorbing the inconvenience so the rest can stay comfortable. I had absorbed things my whole life. I just didn't realize how invisible that skill had made me. Melissa began speaking for me in rooms I was standing in. If someone asked whether I wanted tea, she'd answer before I could. If plans were being discussed, she'd smile and say, "She's fine with whatever." It was always said sweetly, like a favor. My silence had been interpreted as agreement, then as preference, then as personality. The children watched everything. They didn't mean harm. They were just learning the rules as they were being written. Mom says Grandma doesn't like noise. Mom says Grandma doesn't need much food. Mom says Grandma prefers being alone. These weren't insults. They were instructions. Repeated often enough, instructions start sounding like facts. I felt myself shrinking in their eyes, not because I was weak, but because someone louder had already decided who I was. Daniel stayed busy. That was his shield. Long hours, work calls during dinner, nodding without really listening. When I tried to explain that I felt left out, he looked genuinely confused, like I was describing a problem he didn't have the tools to see. "I'm sure she doesn't mean it that way," he said more than once. One evening, Melissa corrected me mid-sentence about something small, what day the trash goes out, of all things, and I saw Daniel hesitate. Just for a second. He opened his mouth like he might step in. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced down, muttered something about work, and the moment folded itself away. I told myself not to read into it. Hope can be reckless if you're not careful. Small things began stacking up. My medication refills started coming late again. There was always an explanation. Insurance delays. Pharmacy issues. Miscommunication. It was always explained. It was never corrected. My chair at the table shifted farther from the conversation without anyone physically moving it. Meals happened earlier, then separately, because schedules had changed and no one thought to mention it. I stopped asking questions because answers came wrapped in patience that felt like dismissal. I began feeling like a visitor in a house I helped pay for, an extra in a family play where my role had already been rewritten without my consent. I didn't confront anyone. Not out of fear, but out of clarity. I understood that loud resistance would only confirm the version of me they were slowly building, difficult, sensitive, old. Instead, I watched. I listened. I remembered. I noticed how Melissa organized stories the way she organized cabinets, moving things until the picture made sense to her. I started keeping copies of paperwork without announcing it. I paid attention to dates, to wording, to patterns. I stopped reminding people twice. I let gaps form naturally, the way truth prefers to surface when you don't force it. Carol from next door noticed before anyone inside the house did. She asked if I was okay the way people do when they already know the answer. When I brushed it off, she didn't insist. She just said, "If you ever need a ride or just a coffee, I'm usually around." No pity. No drama. Just an open option. That stayed with me longer than she probably knew. That was the moment something shifted inside me, quietly but permanently. I realized my silence hadn't been protecting the family. It had been protecting a version of events that was convenient for everyone except me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't announce a change. I simply stopped disappearing on cue. I began taking up space in small, undeniable ways. And once you stop fading quietly, people eventually have to notice what they were standing on. They still talked about me like I wasn't in the room, but now they watched me a little more closely while they did it. That's how I knew something had shifted for them too. Silence changes its meaning once it stops being obedient. Melissa didn't accuse me of anything outright. She didn't need to. Her tone stayed polite, her smile stayed steady, but there was a new edge to her efficiency, like she was tightening loose screws she'd just noticed. She double-checked things I touched. She reorganized spaces I used. Not aggressively, just thoroughly, as if my habits were small errors she was correcting for the sake of order. Daniel noticed the changes in the house before he noticed the changes in me. He commented on how calm things felt, how smooth everything ran lately. He said it like a compliment, like harmony had finally been achieved. I nodded because explaining would have sounded like complaining, and I had learned the hard way that complaints get remembered longer than patterns. The kids followed Melissa's lead the way kids always do. They asked her before asking me. They waited for her reaction before responding to mine. When I offered help, they glanced at her first, checking for approval like it was a rule written somewhere I hadn't seen. None of it was cruel. That was the part that made it so effective. It was clean. It was quiet. It was done with good intentions that only ever benefited one person. I started spending more time outside the house, not dramatically, just practically. Longer walks. Extra errands. Coffee that took a little while. Carol noticed, of course. She always did. She didn't pry. She just said things like, "Nice day to be out," or "Good to see you." Normal words, spoken like they meant I still belonged somewhere. I began storing small pieces of my life away from the house. Documents, mail, prescriptions, all kept neatly in a folder that lived in my bag. I didn't announce it. I didn't hide it either. I just stopped assuming the house was a neutral space. Melissa started hosting more. Playdates, dinners, church friends. She was flawless in public, warm and attentive, always making sure I was included just enough to look considerate. She'd ask me questions in front of people, the kind that sounded thoughtful but had already been answered privately. "You're okay with this, right?" The room would pause, waiting for me to confirm the version of me she had already sold. I learned how to answer without giving anything away. I smiled. I agreed. I let the moment pass. I was collecting something more valuable than approval. I was collecting contrast. Daniel's confusion deepened. He sensed tension but couldn't locate its source. One evening he asked me gently if everything was all right. I told him the truth, the careful version. I said the house felt different. He laughed softly and said houses change when families grow. He kissed my cheek like that settled it. I watched him walk away with relief written all over his back, grateful the problem had stayed vague. That was when I understood something important. He didn't need clarity. He needed comfort. And Melissa was very good at providing that. The first real crack showed up in a place no one expected. Money. Not missing money, just misplaced confidence. A bill paid twice. Another delayed. A small argument between Melissa and Daniel over a charge neither remembered making. She brushed it off, said she'd handle it. She always said that. I didn't step in. I didn't correct anyone. I just noted how often "I've got it" replaced actual answers. The house began to feel tense in a new way, like everyone was walking carefully but no one knew why. Melissa became sharper with the kids when things didn't go smoothly. Daniel worked later. I stayed observant. One afternoon, Carol asked if I could help her sort some boxes. I said yes without thinking. While we worked, she talked about her sister, about how easy it is for families to overlook someone once they stop demanding attention. She said it casually, like an observation, not advice. I felt something settle in my chest, solid and calm. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't sensitive. I was simply no longer willing to vanish quietly. Back home, Melissa started slipping. Just small slips. A tone that lingered too long. A correction that sounded like an order. A story retold slightly differently each time. People began noticing, not because I pointed anything out, but because the effort to control everything leaves fingerprints. Daniel caught one of those moments. A quick exchange between Melissa and me that went silent when he entered the room. He didn't say anything, but he looked at her differently after that, like he was recalibrating a picture he thought he understood. I didn't push. I didn't explain. I let him sit with the discomfort. The truth doesn't need help when it's already walking towards someone. I could feel the house reaching a point where pretending required more energy than honesty. Melissa felt it too. Her politeness grew tight, her patience thinner. She still smiled, but it didn't always reach her eyes. I stayed calm. I stayed present. I stayed impossible to paint as the problem. Whatever was coming next, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't afraid of it anymore. Silence had stopped being my shield. It had become my strategy. They began asking me questions again, but not the way they used to. These weren't polite check-ins or courtesy gestures. These were clarifying questions, the kind people ask when they're trying to make sense of a picture that no longer lines up. Melissa noticed it before I did. She always noticed shifts before anyone else. Her kindness sharpened into performance, like she was overcorrecting for something she couldn't quite identify. She laughed louder when people were around. She explained things that didn't need explaining. She narrated my actions as if I might forget who I was without her commentary. I let her. Because the more someone talks for you, the more obvious it becomes when they don't actually understand you. Daniel started lingering during conversations he used to walk away from. He didn't interrupt, didn't challenge, just stayed. Watched. Listened. One evening, he stood in the doorway while Melissa corrected me about something small, the kind of correction that sounds helpful until you realize it's unnecessary. She caught his look too late. It was brief, but it was enough. After that, she became careful. Not kinder. Just more precise. The kids picked up on the tension without understanding it. They tested boundaries, watched reactions. One afternoon, my granddaughter asked me if she was allowed to sit next to me on the couch. Allowed. The word landed heavy, but I didn't react. I smiled and said she didn't need permission. She looked confused, then relieved. Melissa pretended not to hear. The house felt crowded with unspoken things. Bills arrived more frequently. Conversations about money stretched longer than usual. Melissa kept reassuring Daniel that everything was under control. That phrase started showing up everywhere. Under control. Like a promise. Like a warning. I noticed the way she avoided specifics. The way questions were redirected instead of answered. Daniel noticed too, though he didn't say it out loud. He started reviewing things himself, quietly. I stayed out of it. That was important. I didn't want truth to look like it had help. Carol came by one morning with a bag of muffins and no explanation. We sat at the table like it was any other day. She talked about her bridge club, about a woman who'd lost her footing in her own family, and how long it took people to notice. Funny thing, she said, stirring her coffee, when someone's always handling everything, nobody asks how. She wasn't looking at me when she said it. She didn't need to. That night, Melissa snapped at Daniel over something trivial. The sound cut through the house sharper than usual. It wasn't yelling, just impatience without polish. Daniel didn't respond right away. He waited, then asked her to repeat herself. She did, softer this time, wrapped in a laugh that didn't quite fit. He nodded, but something in him had shifted. You could feel it. Like when a floorboard creaks and you realize it's been loose for a while. I began spending weekends with Carol, helping her sort, run errands, do nothing in particular. Melissa framed it as generosity, telling people how nice it was that I had somewhere to go. Daniel didn't comment, but he started asking when I'd be back, not out of obligation, but curiosity. The narrative Melissa had built was thinning. She tried to tighten it by taking control of bigger things. Appointments. Schedules. Decisions that didn't belong to her. The more she reached, the more visible her grip became. One afternoon, Daniel found a stack of unopened mail that should have been handled weeks earlier. He asked her about it. She had an answer. She always did. But this time, he asked a follow-up question. Then another. Her irritation slipped through before she caught it. Just a flash. Just enough. He apologized afterward, like he always did, but the apology didn't erase the moment. It only underlined it. I watched him retreat into thought more often. Less certainty. More silence. The house grew quieter in a different way. Not peaceful. Watchful. Melissa started treating me like a variable she hadn't accounted for. She didn't confront me. She circled. Asked questions that sounded casual but weren't. I answered honestly, but briefly. The less I explained, the more she filled in herself. That's when mistakes happen. The kids stopped checking with her before speaking to me. Not all at once. Just occasionally. Enough to notice. Enough to unsettle her. One evening, Daniel asked me if I felt comfortable in the house. The question hung between us, careful and heavy. I told him the truth. I said comfort is a tricky word. He didn't press. He didn't need to. The truth had already found its place. Melissa watched us from across the room, smiling like nothing was wrong. But smiles can't cover everything forever. Some truths don't need to be spoken to be heard. They just need space. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't shrinking to make space for anyone else. They didn't fall apart all at once, not the way movies show it. It happened in small, inconvenient moments, the kind no one can explain away. Daniel started coming home earlier, not because he suspected anything, but because something in the house no longer felt settled. The energy had shifted, like furniture moved an inch to the left and everyone pretending not to notice. Melissa noticed, of course. She always did. Her questions sharpened, her smiles stayed a beat too long, her tone picked up that tight edge people get when they're trying to hold water in their hands. I stayed the same. That was the mistake she never learned to plan for. I still folded laundry the way I always had. I still cleaned up after dinner without announcing it. I still spoke when spoken to and listened more than I talked. To her, consistency looked like weakness. To me, it was cover. One afternoon, Daniel asked me to help him look for an old insurance document. Not urgently. Casually. The kind of request that sounds harmless unless you understand timing. It should have been filed, labeled, handled. Melissa said she'd taken care of it months ago, said it with confidence and a half smile that suggested the matter was closed. We didn't accuse. We didn't press. We just looked. Boxes opened. Drawers emptied. Envelopes stacked. The silence grew thick in the room, not hostile, just undeniable. It was the kind of silence that makes people restless. When the document turned up weeks later in a place it didn't belong, Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't sigh. He simply thanked her for finding it. That scared her more than anger ever could. After that, things started surfacing on their own. A missed payment that had been explained away as a banking error. A medical bill I'd never seen but had been marked resolved without my signature. My prescriptions refilled late not once, not twice, but in a pattern Daniel could no longer unsee. Melissa had always relied on urgency to outrun questions. The story she'd been telling worked only if no one slowed down. Once Daniel did, it unraveled. He started asking for numbers instead of reassurance. Dates instead of summaries. Copies instead of promises. He didn't confront her. He observed her. That change alone shifted the balance. The kids felt it too. They stopped performing around her, stopped checking her face before speaking. Children always know when something isn't right, even if they don't have the words. One night, my grandson asked Daniel why Mom always answered for Grandma. The question landed in the room like something fragile and heavy. Melissa laughed it off, said kids say weird things, said I'd always been quiet. Daniel didn't laugh. He nodded, tucked the question away, the way people do when they're afraid of the answer, but know they'll come back for it. I didn't push. I didn't explain. I had learned that truth doesn't need help when lies are already doing all the work. The final shift came quietly, the way most real endings do. Daniel asked me to come with him to the bank, said he wanted my signature on something old, something routine. Melissa offered to come. He told her it wasn't necessary, his voice polite but firm. The look on her face wasn't anger. It was calculation, too late to matter. The banker spoke plainly, the way professionals do when they assume everyone in the room knows what's going on. Accounts discussed. Transfers clarified. Timelines corrected. Questions answered without drama. I watched Daniel's reflection in the glass as years rearranged themselves behind his eyes. He didn't look at me. He stared at the table, jaw tight, absorbing the cost of not having looked sooner. In the car afterward, no one spoke. Silence used to scare me. That day, it felt clean. At home, Melissa tried to explain. She always had explanations. Stress. Good intentions. Misunderstandings. Love twisted into management. She said she was holding things together. Daniel listened longer than I expected. He didn't interrupt. Then he asked one question, just one. Why didn't you ever tell me? She said she was protecting him. That's when he finally looked at me. I told him the truth, the only one that mattered. I said I thought silence was the price of keeping the family intact. I said I didn't realize until recently that silence was only protecting the person who benefited from it. Melissa cried then, real tears, not performance. I didn't take pleasure in it. Tears don't reverse patterns. Consequences don't need cruelty to be effective. She moved out slowly, wrapped in dignity she hadn't offered me, telling people it was mutual, that space was healthy. I didn't correct her. Peace doesn't require footnotes. The kids adjusted faster than anyone expected. Children always do when the air gets lighter. They visited without hesitation, asked questions without fear. Daniel apologized more than once. Sometimes softly. Sometimes with guilt that sat heavy between us. I didn't rush to forgive. Forgiveness isn't a favor, it's a process. We rebuilt carefully, with honesty instead of urgency, learning how to speak without translating every feeling into defense. I moved into a small place of my own, close enough to visit, far enough to breathe. The first morning there, I made coffee exactly how I liked it, strong and unapologetic, and sat by the window without waiting for permission to exist. No one checked what I was doing. No one corrected my tone. The quiet felt earned. Melissa still tells people she tried her best. Maybe she believes it. I don't argue. I don't need to. Respect found its way back to me the moment I stopped negotiating for it. I didn't raise my voice, didn't expose anyone publicly, didn't demand an apology that wouldn't mean anything. I simply stepped out of the role they had written for me. And that was enough. If you believe elders deserve respect, not quiet control, then stay. Stories like this don't end loudly. They end honestly.